The galaxy was quiet when the broadcast began. A tall, muscular alien with golden skin stood in the center of a glowing arena. His name was Korathal, master of 10,000 strikes, champion of the Red Rings, and undefeated for 20 years. He looked into the camera and said in a deep voice, "I challenge any warrior from Earth to face me." Then he smirked. "If your species still has any real fighters." His voice echoed across planets, translated in every language. Most humans ignored it. Some laughed, but one soldier did not. Sergeant Mason Kane was sitting alone in a quiet outpost on Mars. He was retired, forgotten, with a beard like steel wool and tired eyes that had seen too many wars. When he saw the challenge, he didn't smile, didn't speak. He simply stood, grabbed his old duffel bag, and walked out into the red dust. Everyone at the Martian port stared as he walked past them. Where is he going? Someone whispered, "To get himself killed." Another answered. But no one stopped him. Mason booked a small shuttle to the Orion Arena where Korathal was waiting. No armor, no backup, no fancy gear, just an old uniform and a soldier's heart. The shuttle landed quietly, and Mason stepped out as the crowd booed and laughed. The alien audience had expected someone more impressive. What they saw was a man with scars, gray in his hair and calm in his steps. Korathal stepped forward, looking down at Mason with amusement. "This is Earth's answer." He laughed. A human relic. Mason didn't speak. He just stretched his neck, rolled his shoulders, and looked at the center of the arena. The announcer shouted, "Begin." And the match started. Korathal charged first. His movements fast, like lightning. He spun, kicked, and struck with speed that shocked the air. But Mason dodged with slow, careful steps, just enough to stay untouched. The crowd roared, but Mason didn't react. He was studying his enemy, watching, reading, calculating. One alien in the crowd said, "Why doesn't he fight back?" Another replied, "Maybe he's scared." But deep inside, Mason wasn't scared. He was waiting for the right moment, and when it came, his hand moved like a bullet. One clean punch, fast, heavy, landed on Korathal's chest. The alien stumbled back in shock. He touched his armor, surprised to see a crack forming on it. It wasn't supposed to break, not from a human fist. The crowd went silent. Mason stood still again, breathing slowly. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply raised his fist again, ready for the next move. Korathal's expression changed. No more jokes, no more mocking. This human was real and dangerous. "Who trained you?" Korathal growled, stepping forward. Mason answered, "Pain." That one word echoed louder than any roar. The match continued, and Mason moved like a soldier, controlled, powerful, and cold. He didn't waste energy, didn't show off. Every move he made had purpose. Every strike was a message. Korathal tried 3 more styles, flipping, twisting, roaring with energy. But Mason kept his feet on the ground and his eyes on the target. He blocked, stepped aside, then countered with perfect timing. By the end of the first round, Korathal had bruises on his face and sweat on his brow that had never happened before. And Mason? He was calm, standing like he'd just gone for a walk. The alien crowd started to shift in their seats. This human was not what they expected. He wasn't fast or flashy or loud, but he was something more, something terrifying in the shadows. Above the arena, a group of alien generals watched closely. One said, "If this is what human soldiers are like, we've been making a big mistake." Back in the arena, Mason looked up, scanning the lights. He felt eyes on him, not just the crowd, but something bigger. He didn't care. He came for one reason: to remind the galaxy what a human soldier truly is. As the round ended, Korathal stepped back, breathing hard. He looked into Mason's eyes and saw something he didn't expect. Not hate, not fear, just stillness, like the eye of a storm waiting to be unleashed. The crowd didn't laugh anymore. They watched in silence, unsure what would happen next, and Mason. He simply whispered to himself, "Round 1. Korathal's fists glowed with electric energy as he stepped forward. Angry now, no more showmanship, no more play. The first punch he threw cracked the floor under Mason's feet, but the human wasn't there anymore. He had already moved, just a step to the side, not flashy, but perfectly timed. The second punch missed too, then the third. And suddenly Korathal was off balance. Mason didn't smile. He never smiled. But he raised his arm and delivered one sharp elbow into Korhal's side. The alien staggered, blinking in disbelief. That elbow felt like it came from a metal club. Korhal snarled and leaped back, flexing his muscles, shifting his stance. He changed styles, this one faster, more brutal. Spinning kicks and double strikes that would crush most bones, but Mason had already seen the rhythm, the beat of the dance, and he didn't dance like that. He moved in tight, controlled circles, always inside the danger zone where most feared to go. One of the alien watchers gasped. "He's too close to strike like that." But Mason struck anyway once, twice, 3 times, all in less than a second. Korathal howled, stepping back again, his lip bleeding green, his pride cracking more than his armor. In the audience, silence fell again. Not one voice shouted, not one cheer. Everyone was watching the human now, trying to understand what they were seeing. This wasn't normal strength. This wasn't luck. This was training, brutal and real. Mason moved slowly, never rushed. Like he had all the time in the world, Korathal paced in a circle, his hands shaking just slightly. He had trained with grandmasters, battled champions of 6 systems, and never been touched like this. This wasn't how the fight was supposed to go. Humans were supposed to break, not bend. They were supposed to panic under pressure, not grow. Sharper Korathal charged again, letting out a battle cry, spinning into a full-body strike. He caught Mason on the shoulder, sending him sliding a few meters across the ground. Finally, some of the audience clapped, thinking the tide had turned. Mason rolled to a stop and slowly stood up. He rotated his shoulder, rolled his neck, and rolled his neck, and gave Korathal a single look. That look wasn't angry or surprised. It was disappointed. Then he ran, not away but toward. Korathal barely raised his arms before Mason's fist slammed into his gut. Then came a knee to the thigh, an elbow to the jaw. A final open palm to the chest that sent the alien crashing into the wall of the arena. Dust rose as the impact cracked. The glowing panel behind him, the crowd still said nothing. They were frozen. Mason didn't move either. He just stood, breathing steady. Korathal coughed, then laughed quietly. "I underestimated you," he said, voice rough. "You all do." Mason replied softly. From a distance, cameras zoomed in on Mason's face. It was calm, unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, an old storm that never passed. He had seen real war, lost real friends, survived places that broke stronger men. This was not his hardest fight, not even close. An alien commentator finally spoke. "I believe we are witnessing a human technique unknown to our records." Another replied, "This is no technique. This is survival instinct at its purest." They were both right and both wrong. Mason didn't train for tournaments. He trained to kill and not die. Everything he did was built on pain, on loss, on pressure. He didn't learn from books, but from scars. Korathal stood again, slower now, a grim smile on his face. He was not angry anymore. He was excited. This was the first real fight he'd had in years. And deep down, even as a proud warrior, part of him was glad. He raised his hands, again, nodding once at Mason, and, for the first time, Mason nodded back, not out of respect, but understanding. They both knew what the next round meant. This was no longer about species, or pride, or planets. Now it was just two fighters who refused to fall, and the galaxy was watching in silence, waiting for the next strike to decide everything. Long ago, in another part of the galaxy, Mason Kane stood alone on a burning field. The sun had vanished behind smoke, and screams filled the air. His squad was gone. Every friend lost in a war that never made it into history books, he remembered. Holding a broken weapon, bleeding, choking on dust. And yet he had stood again and again. Not because he was strong, but because there was no other choice. That memory never left him, not in dreams, not in peace, not even now in the glowing alien arena as he looked at Korathal, still standing but shaking. Mason remembered everything. That had shaped him. He didn't become a soldier by choice. He became one because survival demanded it, and that kind of training never fades. Koralez's chest was rising and falling fast. His stance looked perfect, but inside his heart was racing. For the first time in his life, he realized he didn't know what to do next. Every technique had failed. Every style had been read like an open book by this quiet human. He had studied for decades, mastered energy, flow, combat rhythm, sacred stances, but none of it mattered here. The human didn't follow rules, didn't follow style. He followed instinct, pain, and pressure. Mason stepped forward again, slow and steady, like death walking in boots. Korathal struck first. But it wasn't clean. It wasn't confident. Mason blocked with his arm and countered with a strike so low and brutal that Korathal gasped for breath. It was a soldier's move, a battlefield move, meant to stop a fight, not win points. The audience didn't cheer. They were silent again, watching something they had never seen before. Not just a fight, but a lesson. A lesson in pain, in willpower, in what it means to be human. Mason moved in close and whispered just loud enough for the alien to hear. "This isn't a match for me. This is just another bad day." That sentence hit harder than his fists. Far above the arena, alien generals and warlords stared at screens, their expressions turning serious. Files were being opened. Human combat records pulled from archives. Whispers filled command rooms. Are all humans like this? No one had answers. Not yet. Korathal's legs began to tremble. Not from pain, but from realization. He had trained in perfect environments with the best masters. On golden floors and under clean skies, Mason had trained in mud, in blood, under falling ash and sirens. And now that difference was clear. Mason struck again, not fast, not flashy, but hard. The kind of hit that breaks ribs and breaks egos. Korathal fell back, catching himself, coughing. He had never lost before, never been dropped. Never felt this fear rising in his throat. In that moment, something shifted in the arena. Not fear, but respect. The crowd didn't see a human anymore. They saw something else. Something terrifying and beautiful. A being built from fire and loss, but still walking forward. Mason didn't chase. He didn't raise his fists in triumph. He simply adjusted his stance and waited, like a soldier taught to fight until told to stop. He didn't care about victory. He cared about sending a message. Humans break bones, but first, they break your spirit. Korathal stood again, slower, his breath ragged, his eyes wide. He wasn't angry now, just quiet, and that silence between them said more than any word ever could. For the first time, he bowed his head slightly, not in surrender, but in respect. Mason didn't respond, just watched, his face unreadable. He didn't want trophies, or cheers, or medals. He just wanted truth to be seen, that Earth's soldiers may come in silence, but they leave their mark in history. The bell rang, signaling the end of the round. but no one moved. Everyone waited, eyes on Mason and Mason. He turned his back, walked toward his corner, and wiped blood from his eyebrow. The fight wasn't over yet, but something had already been won, and deep inside, Korathal knew it. The storm had arrived. And it wore human skin. Korathal had never been here before. Not physically, he had fought in this arena many times. But this place, this feeling, this silence inside his head was all new. He was staring at a man who didn't shout, didn't glow, didn't even breathe heavy. And yet that man had cracked something deep inside him. Mason didn't speak as he waited in his corner. He didn't stretch, didn't look at the cameras. He just rolled his shoulders once and stared into nothing. The memories were rising again. The ones he couldn't kill with fists or time, friends. Screaming blood on cold steel, the long walk home alone. Korathal wiped green blood from his jaw and clenched his fists. He had to dig deeper now, into something he had never touched before. He closed his eyes and whispered a command in his language. From the edge of the arena, one of his students activated a hidden protocol. His body began to shift, energy folding through his muscles. The crowd gasped as the master's form changed. His arms thickened, his eyes turned bright silver, ancient. Tattoos along his ribs began to glow. He had unlocked a forbidden stance dot, only 2 bloodline champions, and never used in public before. But even as the power pulsed through his veins, something felt wrong. He looked across at Mason, who hadn't moved an inch. The human just tilted his head slightly and spoke for the first time that round. "I've seen monsters, and they screamed." Louder than you, the bell rang. Korathal moved first, faster than ever. Each step thundered through the floor. Each punch came with energy blasts. He hit the wall behind Mason twice, cracked a pillar with a missed kick, and sent shockwaves through the entire arena, but Mason kept slipping past the edge of every strike. Quiet, unreadable. When he finally struck, it was like thunder without warning. He stepped forward and used his whole body in one motion-y human technique called the shoulder breaker. It landed under Korathal's chin and sent him reeling backward, stumbling across the floor. The crowd screamed, but not in sheer confusion. In awe. This was not supposed to be possible. The master's strongest form had just been broken by something old. Something simple. Korathal shouted in frustration and rushed again. Launching 5 strikes in a row, each one came from a different direction, using a different style. But Mason had seen worse. He had fought enemies that didn't breathe. Fought in zero gravity with broken ribs. He blocked 2 punches with his forearm, ducked the third, then grabbed Korathal's wrist mid-spin with a grunt. He twisted it and slammed the alien to the ground with pure, dirty battlefield technique. Korathal groaned, stunned, wind knocked from his lungs. And the arena fell into shocked silence again. A camera zoomed in on Mason's eyes. They were sharp not with pride, but focus. He wasn't here to prove he was better. He was here to finish what had started the moment the challenge went out. Korathal lay on the floor, coughing, staring at the lights above. His entire world spun around him, not because of the pain, but because of the truth. He had trained his whole life to be a master, but this human hadn't trained for show. He had trained to survive, and that made every move deadly. He stood again, knees shaking for the first time in years. Korathal bowed not as a challenge, but as a warning. "I will not hold back any more," he said, voice trembling slightly. Mason replied, "You've never had the luxury to hold back in my world above the arena." Generals leaned closer to their screens. The room had gone quiet, full of tension, full of fear. A voice whispered, "If this is just one human soldier, what happens if Earth sends more?" Back in the ring, the 2 warriors circled each other once more. But now, it wasn't just a fight. It was a collision of 2 worlds, one that trained for balance and pride, and one that trained for pain, loss, and survival. And everyone watching knew only one of those worlds would walk away standing. Mason didn't flinch as Corythel's foot slammed into the ground beside him. Cracking stone like glass, he stood there, silent, watching the alien master breathe harder with each passing second. Power was burning through Corythel's body, too much energy, too much pressure. It wasn't strength anymore, it was desperation wearing armor. Mason adjusted his stance slightly. A small move, almost lazy, but that tiny shift made the crowd lean forward. Only trained eyes could see what was coming, and Corythel saw it too late. The human's elbow shot out like lightning, landing under Corythel's ribs. The alien gasped, his eyes wide. He tried to counter, but Mason was already past him. Spinning behind with a strike to the back of the leg, Corythel fell to one knee, growling in frustration. "I am not your enemy," Mason said, voice low, calm. "But I won't stop until you understand." Corythel launched a wild punch, full of power, but without control. Mason stepped aside, grabbed his wrist mid-swing, and twisted it hard. The snap echoed across the arena, and the master roared in pain. But even as his arm hung limp, Corythel didn't quit. He stood again, raised his chin, and shouted something in his native tongue from the stands. One of his students threw a glowing orb into the ring. It landed at his feet and began to pulse with light. A second transformation began, this one ancient, dangerous, illegal. His skin turned dark red. His muscles doubled, and spikes rose along his back and shoulders. Alien guards stepped closer to the edge of the arena, but didn't interfere. They all wanted to see how far this fight would go. Mason didn't blink. He just exhaled slowly and took off his jacket. Underneath, his body told a different story, scars over scars. Burns along his arms, a twisted mark near his shoulder from some forgotten war. The crowd gasped, not because of muscles or strength, but because of what those scars meant. This man had lived through something worse than anything Corythel had ever faced. And he was still standing. Corythel charged with inhuman speed, roaring like a beast. He smashed into Mason, sending both of them sliding across the floor. Dust flew up, lights flickered, and the sound of impact echoed like thunder. The arena held its breath, waiting for Mason to fall. But when the dust cleared, he was already standing, bleeding from his lip. Bruised but standing tall, he walked slowly toward Corythel, wiping the blood with the back of his hand. Then, in one motion, he leaped forward and drove his knee into the alien's chest. The blow cracked armor, knocked the wind out of Corythel, and sent him crashing to the ground. The crowd was no longer watching a fight. They were watching a collapse. Corythel coughed, tried to rise again, his legs shaking. He reached for another stance, another form, anything to keep going. But his body refused. Mason stood over him, fists still raised, ready, but he didn't strike. He waited, eyes calm, breathing steady. Corythel looked up, not with anger, but with confusion. "How are you doing this?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. Mason leaned down, looked him in the eyes, and said, "Because I already died. Once, I just didn't stay down." For the first time in his life, Corythel had no answer. He lowered his head, the glow in his body slowly fading, and the fight was over. But something more powerful remained, respect. And the galaxy, which once called humans weak, now saw the truth. Silence hung in the arena like smoke after fire. Corythel knelt in the dust, not by choice, but because his body wouldn't rise anymore. His chest burned, bones ached. His pride lay shattered beside him. He had given everything, every stance, every form, every ounce of energy his ancestors had passed down, and none of it was enough. Mason didn't move. Not to celebrate, not to speak. He just watched the broken champion before him. Not with joy, not with hatred, but with something deeper understanding. Because Mason had been there too, on a muddy field. With bullets screaming and the ground shaking, he had once knelt in defeat, thinking it was the end. That's why he didn't strike again. He knew when a warrior had nothing left to give. Up in the control tower, alien generals argued in hushed voices. "This is not just strength," one said. "It's something else. He doesn't fight." "Like us," another whispered, "he fights like he's already lost everything." Corathel looked up, blinking against the light. His mouth was dry, his arms limp, but his eyes still held fire. He forced himself to speak. "You? You are no soldier." Mason tilted his head. "You're right," he said. "I'm the reason soldiers get sent home alive." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Not from the words, but from the weight behind them. The kind of weight that only comes from graves, from funerals, from medals left unopened in drawers. Mason took one step forward. And Corathal flinched, his instincts screaming, but his body not responding. Mason dropped something beside him, something metal and old. It was a broken human dog tag. Rusted, bent, unreadable. "This belonged to a friend," Mason said. Softly, "He trained with me, bled beside me, died before me. I don't fight to win," he continued. "I fight so others don't have to." The alien master stared at the small object like it held a universe inside. He reached for it slowly, hands shaking when his fingers touched it. Something in his face changed, not fear, not shame, but truth. The truth that he had never really known war until now. From the stands, alien warriors who once laughed now stood in silence. Some bowed their heads, others placed fists over their hearts because they knew what they were seeing wasn't a battle. It was a lesson carved into flesh and blood. Corathal managed to rise, barely. Legs trembling, he took the dog tag and held it tight. Then looked Mason in the eye. "Teach me," he said, voice raw and cracked. "Not how to fight like you, but how to endure like you." Mason didn't answer right. Away, he turned his head slightly, looked up at the dark sky above the arena dome. Then he nodded once, slow and silent. Because that was the real win, not the crowd, not the match. But when an enemy chooses to understand instead of strike, the arena lights dimmed, the match declared. But no one really cheered. They simply watched as two warriors stood side by side. One broken but awake, the other haunted but still walking. And for the first time in the galaxy's history, an alien master bowed not out of loss, but out of deep, honest respect for a human. The arena stood empty now, its lights dimmed, the crowd long gone. But the echoes of what happened still lived in every corner. Guards whispered about it. Students replayed the footage in training halls. Even the warlords who once mocked Earth now studied the humans' every move, frame by frame, trying to understand how a man with no armor, no fame, and no special rank brought a legend to his knees. Back in the underground chamber, Corathal sat alone. His arm was wrapped, his ribs still healing, but the pain didn't bother him. What stayed with him was the quiet voice of the human, the calm in chaos, the strength in silence. He had faced many warriors in his life, but Mason Kane was something else. Not a fighter, not a killer, but something far more dangerous. A man who didn't fear pain, because he had already survived worse. Corathal stared at the human dog tag on the table in front of him. He had cleaned it, polished it, but the name was still unreadable, faded by time and blood. Still, it held weight like a promise made across galaxies. He kept it close, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Meanwhile, Mason walked through the shipyard in silence. No crowd followed him, no reporters, no fans, just the hiss of steam and the soft clang of metal as he boarded a supply freighter. He didn't stay for interviews, didn't wait for honors. That wasn't why he came. A young alien cadet stopped him near the docking gate. She looked nervous, holding a training spear in her shaking hands. "Sir," she said quietly, "will you teach me?" Mason looked at her, not her uniform, not her weapon, just her eyes. He saw fear, but also hunger, a spark. He nodded once. "Meet me at sunrise." Word spread fast by the next morning. 12 cadets waited outside the old freighter. By the end of the week, there were 40. Some were alien warriors, some were ex-soldiers. Others were just curious, and every one of them came not to learn how to fight, but how to survive. Mason trained them the same way he was trained hard. Cold, honest. He didn't promise glory, he promised bruises, failure, and pain. But he also promised that when the day came and everything else broke, they would still stand far across the stars. Korathal sent a message every month, not two. Ask for advice, not to boast, but to tell Mason what he had learned, who he had helped, and who had learned to get up after falling. It was quiet work, not seen by the public, but felt across 100 systems and slowly, without medals or banners. The name Mason Kane became something whispered with respect, not because he beat a champion, but because he showed the galaxy what humans truly were. Not loud, not flashy. Not flawless, but unbreakable, because when all else fails, the human doesn't rise to win. He rises so someone else can. And that's why Korathal paid the price. Not for underestimating a man, but for forgetting what it means to be human.